Hello. Today I'm going to be reading to you Life's a Witch, the New Orleans Nocturnal Book 3 by Carrie Pulkinen, presented to you by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Crimson Oliver was a bad witch. Not as bad and wicked. She wasn't green, most witches weren't, and she didn't run around cackling at little girls telling them she'd get them and their little dogs too. She didn't ride a broom, and though she required about an army of flying monkeys, her request was ignored. No, Crimson didn't have a wicked bone in her body, but she was bad. Bad as in nearly every spell she tried to cast went away in some way or another, and that self-proclaimed badness was what landed her here in the hot seat in front of the entire council of elders in New Orleans' Coven of Witches. Crimson sat in the straight-backed wooden chair, facing a long rectangular table that occupied a 2-foot-tall platform in a great room of the 19th century mansion. 4 elders flanked the high priestess perched in her burgundy velvet armchair as the center of the table. At 5'4", with a stocky build, the priestess Rosemary wore her dark brown hair woven into a large, long braids that cascaded down to her waist, and her eyes held contempt as she was waiting for the rest of the high-ranking witches in the coven to file into the room. Tugging at the neck of her sweater, Crimson tried to alleviate the warmth her nerves were producing. It didn't help that the thermostat was set to 85 degrees. She knew this trick. Every witch who'd ever screwed up knew Rosemary liked to turn up the heat, literally, just to watch the accused sweat. What Crimson didn't know was why. Rosemary was the most powerful witch in the coven. Sure, her moral compass could have used some fine-tuning, but her position of high priestess granted her powers no other witch could achieve, no matter how much they practiced. Powers that was the ability to bind another witch's magic, rendering her nothing more than a human. She had everything a witch could want, so why did she take pleasure tormenting her people? Because she's a witch with a capital B. That's why. As the last person entered the chamber, the door thudded shut, and Willow, a lanky blonde with icy blue eyes, who sat in the left of the priestess, lifted her head. Crimson Oliver, please stand. Crimson turned her head slowly to the right and then the left before pressing her hand to her chest and mouthing, "Me?" She sat alone in the center of a room, for goodness sake. It wasn't as if no one could tell who was being accused. The only reason they wanted her to stand was to increase the pressure, hoping she'd crack under the weight of gazes of all those high-ranking witches. But Crimson was the queen of pressure. Her misfiring magic had landed her in enough sticky situations that she picked up everything but money and men. Pressure? Ha! She had like an Instapot on steroids when it came to pressure. She found herself in plenty of trouble more times than she could count, but she always found a way out. Well, almost always. Willow blew out a hard breath through her nose. Please stand so we can hear the charges brought against you. How would standing improve my hearing? The blonde witch's mouth fell open as she looked at the priestess, and Crimson rose to her feet. That was enough pushing back for now. She rested one hand on her hip and scanned the faces of her jury. Agatha's green eyes held concern, but Fern, the red-headed fauna witch, took Rustin Bitch Face to a whole new level. Leela, the coven's second in command and advisor to the priestess, rose to her feet. Her curly black hair spilled over her shoulders, and sympathy filled her gaze as she locked eyes with Crimson. Her charges as follow. 1. Lying under oath when questioned about the disappearance of werewolf Jackson Alterview. 2. Reckless, intentionally harmful use of magic when you cast a spell you are unable to break. 3. Conspiring with the werewolves to cover up your misdeeds. Leela pressed her lips together and shook her head. If found guilty, the High Priestess recommends the binding of your powers indefinitely. How do you plead? Crimson swallowed hard, lifting her chin in defiance to maintain her composure. I'm innocent, of course. The high priestess finally spoke. Your boyfriend broke up with you, so you turned him into a cat. It hardly called innocent. That was so not what happened. Crimson moved her other hand to her hip. Did Jackson tell you that? My information comes from the relative, was confirmed by the Pax Alpha. Did they also tell you it was an accident? Because it was. Well, the actual turning him into a cat part was no accident. It had been part of a sex game they were playing. The wicked witch turns her familiar human as her way with him. She turned Jackson to a cat. Easy peasy. Problem arose when she tried to change him back into human form again. Rosemary lifted one shoulder in dismissive shrug. Accident or not, you used your magic maliciously against another soup. I did no such thing. Leela cleared her throat. We've heard the accusations. Let's address them one at a time and give Crimson the opportunity to defend herself. She crossed her arms. Yes, let's. Rosemary clamped her mouth shut, nodding, and Leela continued. Did you or did you not lie under oath about Jackson's disappearance? I did not. Crimson lowered into the chair and crossed her legs. The specific question asked were whether or not I kidnapped Jackson or put a curse on his pet. I did neither of those things. Jackson stayed with me willingly for fear of ridicule if he turned into his pack and cat form. So the so-called curse the question referred to involved the wolves being force-shifted at seemingly random times. I had no idea my attempts to change Jax back into his human form were affecting the other wolves, so no, I did not lie about either of those things. Leela nodded. The council has reviewed the question and the answers provided. I move to dismiss the charge of lying under oath. All in favor? Everyone on the platform raised their hands except Rosemary, of course, who made me and the coven feel like living inside the movie Mean Girls. Crimson suppressed a smile as she imagined dragging her chair up to the platform just as the priestess would say, You can't sit with us. Moving on to charge number 2. Reckless and intentionally harmful use of magic. Leela scanned the paper on the table. Did you or did you not turn the werewolf into a cat when he threatened to break up with you? No. Crimson clinched her teeth. If she was going to get out of this with her magic intact, she'd have to throw Jax under the bus. Sure, he might be humiliated when the truth came out, but it was better being turned into a human. So you didn't turn Jackson Altiv into a cat? Oh, I did, but he agreed to it. Fern's brows disappeared and her bangs and Agatha's eyes widened. Sorry, Jax, there's no other way around it. Anyway, he said he'd call her, but he never did. Serves him right. It was a sex game. Snickering sounded from the witches behind her, and Willow's cheeks turned pink. As Crimson explained what happened, the murmur in the audience grew louder. She twisted in her chair to stare daggers at people making fun of her. If you find it that amusing, I can't imagine how boring your sex lives must be. Mouths fell open, and several people gasped. Crimson smirked and turned his attention to Leela. Intentionally harmful? Absolutely not. Reckless? She casted her gaze to the ceiling for the moment to pierce her lips. Not reckless either. We planned it. The spell went wrong. That's all. It happens all the time. Crimson was bad at being a witch, but that was not her whole life. She'd rather build on it than leave it empty. Rosemary slapped the palm of the table. That was your third strike. I fixed it so it doesn't count. It does. Let's move on to the final charges. Leela's soothing voice broke the tension. Did you conspire with the werewolves to cover up your misdeeds? A Sophia Barrows, to be specific? Sophia wasn't a werewolf when I discussed the situation with her. She didn't become one until the entire ordeal ended. Thank the goddess that they didn't ask her about her boyfriend, Trace. He actually was a werewolf at the time. In fact, Sophie was a witch with bound powers. If, if this coven were the welcoming place it used to be, we might have been able to help her. The priestess narrowed her eyes. You can skirt around the edges these accusations all you want. It doesn't change the fact that you're an incompetent witch who is a danger to herself and others. You already shrunk the politician's penis into the size of a Vienna sausage and made a priest speak all his thoughts out loud. Now you've almost caused a war between the witches and the werewolves. We can't risk you having powers. Leela came to her defense. She did remedy the situation without the help of the council this time. I vote she gets one more chance. The other witches nodded their agreement, and Rosemary's face pinched. Without the help of the council, maybe, but not without the help of another witch, a dead one. The whispering began to grow into a murmur, and Crimson shot to her feet. It's true. I needed to channel the magic of a fauna witch, so I convinced a necromancer to summon the spirit of a powerful one. With her assistance, I solved the problem without inconveniencing the coven in the slightest. Rosemary stood, leaning her hands to the table and looming her authority over the coven. We almost went to war with your incompetence. You'd love a war. You get off on all this power. Everyone can see that. You're a high priestess over the coven that cowers beneath your rule. Straightening, Rosemary clasped her hands and nodded slowly. Your inability to break the spell on your own is a symbol of your aptitude. As high priestess of the coven, I demand your powers to be bound at once. She cast her gaze to the witches in her high right, then her left. Does anyone oppose? Leela inhaled as she were about to come to Crimson's defense, but much like Gretchen Wieners, the second-rating mean girl in the clique, she kept her mouth shut to avoid being pounded by the bully. Crimson's heart plopped into her stomach like the Mentos into a bottle of Diet Coke, and she wallowed in bitterness, creeping up the back of her throat. You can't be serious. No one imposes this? Every member of the council, aside from the queen bee, of course, cast her gaze at the table or the ceiling, refusing to make eye contact. You don't belong here, Rosemary mentioned toward the intern standing by the wall. Bring the grimoire. The binding will happen immediately. This isn't high school clique, Crimson's voice pitched in panic. It's a coven. I'm a witch. I belong. A young woman laid a thick volume on the table, and Leela rested her hand on the wooden coven. The binding spell is permanent. She looked at Rosemary. Are you sure you want to do this to her? The priestess sneered. Absolutely positive. It's past time a threat like her was neutralized. A threat? Seriously? What did this woman have against her? Rosemary had always been a snob, but the moment she was elected high priestess, she made it her mission to make Crimson's life miserable. Crimson could admit she wasn't the best casting spells. On her deathbed, her mother had unbounded all her magic in a rush. Crimson was just a child, and something had gone wrong. It was the only explanation for her skewed magic. It wasn't her fault. The other witches took pity in Crimson, which annoyed the hell out of her, but Rosemary treated her like a mangy mutt who wouldn't get off her doorstep. Let's see. Where's that spell? Oh, here it is. The priestess tugged on a ribbon and opened the book to the exact page. You had it bookmarked? Crimson gasped. Rosemary knew. She knew she found a way to force the council to agree with her, to at least not oppose her. She always did. The coven trembled into fear with Rosemary as their leader, and her reign of terror needed to end. Fisting her hands to the sign, Crimson stood and summoned her courage, or maybe her stupidity. The jury's still out on that one, and sent the words up in prayer. In the name of the goddess Morgan, I denounce your authority and hereby invoke the supremacy challenge law. Rosemary scoffed. You can't do that. You're on trial. Crimson lifted her chin defiantly and pressed her palms together. Morgan, goddess of battle and sovereignty, with your blessing, I call your supremacy challenge to be granted. The lights flickered, the energy in the room glowed, electric as silent descending, so deafening you could have heard a leprechaun scratch his ass. Armed hair stood on end, and no one dared to utter a breath as the goddess decision charged the air. In unison, every mouth in the room opened and said, "So mote it be." A collective gasp followed the proclamation, and Crimson's head, like she was on merry-go-round, at top speed. What had she done? Rosemary stared blankly ahead, her eyes wide as hula hoops, no doubt in just as much shock as Crimson that the goddess granted her request. A supremacy challenge hadn't been issued in the past 100 years, and now Crimson, of all people, was going to go against the High Priestess in a battle of magical skill. What the hell was she thinking? All right, and that is where I'm going to stop today. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed. Goodbye now.